Tracking is one of the most important features for any visual effects work. It doesn't always have to be a really complicated camera tracking. Even something as simple as a one-point track can allow you to do some pretty cool things. For example, I have here this little dot on my finger, and you can use that to attach a particle system or smoke or a little image or, well, I don't know, anything you like. So that can be already quite cool. So let's get started and see how we can track that. So if you want to do some tracking in Blender, of course, first you have to import the footage. So let's first have a look at the files. So in this folder here, you can see I have the movie file, which I've recorded with a Canon DSLR, the Canon 550D, and that records to H.264 movie files. So you can import that in Blender, but it can be a little bit problematic depending on which version you use. It also depends on the FFmpeg implementation. So, well, currently it does work for me, so I will import this movie file. But since with movie files you always have to do with time codes, with codecs and stuff like that, sometimes it can be easier to first convert your footage into an image sequence. And that is what I've done too. So I've converted that to a sequence of TGA files. TGA files are, as you can see, rather big. So this is HD 1920 by 1080, and that creates almost 8 megabytes per file. But TGA are easy to read by Blender, and there is no compression. If you would encode to a JPEG sequence, then most certainly you would lose some quality. But especially with any compositing or tracking, every pixel counts. So you want to get the best quality as possible. And depending on the camera and on the original footage, it can also make sense to encode to an EXR or a DPX sequence. And that is also something that you will probably receive when you are working on a film scan. That is usually scanned to a DPX image sequence. But anyway, in some cases, image sequences can be easier to deal with because there are no time codes and no codecs and stuff like that. So that are the two things that you can use. Let's go to Blender. So there are several places where you can import videos in Blender. And of course, one thing that you already probably know is the video sequence editor. So here you can import movies and you can also play them back. But this is not useful for tracking. So for tracking, we have a different kind of editor, which is also new since Blender version 2.61. And you can find the editor, which is called the movie clip editor, of course, here in the menu. So in the default layout, usually I just switch to the movie clip editor. And here you can now import the footage. And I will do both. I will import the movie file and I will import the image sequence, just to show you the difference. So I press on open and then browse to the folder with my footage. So there we go. We have the movie file and the image sequence. So let's first just import the image sequence by clicking on the first frame and then on open clip. So that will now import this whole thing. And you can, by holding down the control key and the middle mouse button, you can zoom in, zoom out, just with the middle mouse button, move your footage just as you would an image in the image editor. So this is the normal navigation in Blender. You can use the timeline to scrub forward and backward. And you will notice that the default length of 250 frames is of course not enough for this sequence. So first we can set the end frame to the last frame. So that would be here at frame 881. So here. And to set this as an end frame, you can just press E with your mouse in the timeline. So, or you can just type in the number here. So 1 to 881, that is the length of our sequence. And if you want to play back here in the movie clip editor, you can just hit Alt A for playback. Alright, so you will notice that we have this green bar, this playback here with the number of the frame. And you have this purple bar here, and this slowly fills up with purple color. Now that is the RAM cache filling up, and I have set my RAM maximum to, I don't know, 8 gigabytes or so. But by default, the RAM or the mem cache is set to 128 megabytes, which is not very much. And that is of course something very important when you are dealing with movies. You want to play them fluidly, you would play them fast, so you should set it to all the RAM that you have available. So you can set that in the user preferences. So when you go here, then in the system settings, you can go here to the sequencer area, and here you can set the memory cache limit, which is set to actually 10 gigabytes right now for me, but the default setting is 128. And that is not very much, and usually you will have more. I mean, it can be that you only have 1 gigabyte of RAM or 2, but when you're doing tracking, and if you're serious about that, then you should get as much memory as you can get. Alright, and you can see that with just 128 megabytes, there's really not much that we can keep here in our memory, so that is always a pretty slow playback. So of course everything that is inside the RAM will play back pretty fast, but everything that will have to be loaded from the hard drive can be slower, especially when you are using image sequences. Then it can be slower. If you're using movie files, then also depending on the system, it can be faster. Alright, but in any case, let's set this back to everything you can. In my case, I have 16 gigabytes of memory on my system, so I want to set it to maybe 2 times 4 gigabyte. So I'm really bad at math, so I have to calculate here in Blender's number field, which is pretty cool because you can easily calculate stuff like that here. So 10 gigabytes of RAM I can address here with Blender. So if I hit playback again, Alt A, then now it will be much faster and I can load much more images here in my RAM. So that is the way that you can deal with image sequences here in Blender, but depending on your system and on your Blender version, you can also use movie files. So I just delete the link to that and click on open again, and then browse to my folder and then just load this movie file. So this also loads pretty fast and it's a pretty good playback. The thing is, on OS X, which is my system, just a few days ago I had very bad performance with movie files, especially if they are encoded with H.264. There I had very bad playback because Blender had been using the QuickTime library from my system, but the implementation has been rather bad. So now I have switched to FFmpeg import, which is much better. So actually now I have a decent performance here. So for the rest of this DVD, I will use the movie files directly without exporting to image sequence before. Alright, but now that is clear, I hope. So let's start tracking. Now, the first thing is, speaking of all the RAM and all this image sequence, if I want to track my finger here, I don't need to keep all these frames in the RAM because my finger is just visible from frame 375, so I don't need the first 374 frames. So, in my timeline, I just press S here for start frame, or just type in the number here. So now I don't need to have all the other frames in the RAM, so that can also help to increase the performance just in case you don't have that much memory. So until here, E for end frame, and that is now the sequence where we will do the tracking. And since we don't need the timeline or the properties currently, we can go full screen with Shift Spacebar to better concentrate here on the movie clip editor. Now you notice that we have this panel on the left and on the right. So here on the left we have the tool shelf that you can toggle with T, just like as in the 3D viewport, and also here on the right there is the properties panel that you can toggle with N. And of course, in the properties panel, you have, well, the properties of the display settings, the properties of the camera, of the tracking and other things. And also here on the left, there are tools that you can use to track features in your footage. And just like any other editor in Blender, you have the header down here, where you can also access some view properties, some clip settings and so on. Then over here you have this menu where you can choose the active clip. And if I click on this button, I could switch from tracking intro .mov to the TGA sequence that we had loaded before. Now please note that this is not the path to the file, that is just the title. So I could also just name that intro and it would still be the current path. If you want to change the path of your footage, maybe to exchange the movie file, or if you have lost the path or any other things like that. So if you want to change the path to that data block, then you can do that here in the properties in the footage settings. So here you can reload by clicking on that button or navigate to a different folder and load a new file or just replace the link. Okay, so that is that. Then you have this menu here where you can switch between the different tracking modes. So this is currently set to tracking, which is the default mode, but you can also go to reconstruction and distortion. But this is something that we will do later. So let's stay in the tracking mode and now finally start tracking. So I drag the slider here until one of the first frames here where we can see the point on my finger, maybe 384. This is the frame where you can see this point pretty good. And now to track this point automatically, we will have to add a marker. Now adding a marker can be done here with this menu, add marker and move.